Hello and welcome to the Comfort Corner. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our cozy bedtime stories. Now, sit back and relax. The road to the lighthouse was little more than a winding scar carved into the cliffs, flanked by wind-bent cypress trees and the endless gray of the Pacific. Leo's car, a rusted-out Volvo that had seen better decades, groaned as it climbed the final hill. The sea stretched out to the horizon, a sheet of pewter under a sky that threatened rain. He didn't mind. The gloom suited him. He parked beside the iron gate, its hinges shrieking in protest as he pushed it open. The lighthouse stood tall and weathered, its white paint peeling in long strips, the red dome above dulled by salt and time. It was beautiful in a way that only forgotten places could be, stoic, stubborn, and still standing. Leo slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and stepped onto the gravel path. The wind tugged at his coat, and the scent of brine and kelp filled his lungs. He hadn't painted in months. Not since. He shook the thought away. That was the point of this retreat. To forget. To heal. To be alone. The key had arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, just a note from the property manager: "You'll find everything you need." The lighthouse has a way of taking care of its own. Inside, the air was cool and dry, tinged with the scent of old wood and sea dust. The spiral staircase wound upward like a spine, and the walls were lined with faded photographs, keepers from another era, their eyes solemn, their uniforms crisp. Leo ran his fingers along the banister, feeling the grooves worn by generations of hands. The living quarters were modest: a small kitchen, a sitting room with a fireplace, and a bedroom with a narrow bed and a view of the sea. He dropped his bag and opened the window. The wind howled in like a greeting. That night, he lit a fire and sat with a sketchpad in his lap, staring at the blank page. The flames crackled. The lighthouse creaked. And then, softly, almost imperceptibly, he heard it. A meow. He turned. There, perched on the windowsill, was a cat. Sleek, black, with eyes like polished amber. It blinked at him, then leapt gracefully into the room. "Where did you come from?" Leo asked. The cat padded over and rubbed against his leg, purring like a tiny engine. No collar. No hesitation. As if it had always belonged here. Leo smiled for the first time in weeks. "Guess I'm not alone after all." The cat made itself at home quickly, curling up on the worn armchair by the fire as if it had claimed the spot years ago. Leo watched it for a moment, then turned back to his sketchpad. He drew the curve of the lighthouse's spiral staircase, the jagged cliffs outside, and finally, the cat's amber eyes. It was the first time his hand had moved freely in weeks. The next morning, the fog rolled in thick and heavy, muffling the world in a blanket of silence. Leo brewed coffee in the tiny kitchen and stood by the window, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The cat, he'd started calling it Milo, leapt onto the counter and meowed pointedly. "Breakfast, huh?" Leo muttered, rummaging through the pantry. To his surprise, there was a small stash of cat food tucked behind a row of canned beans. He paused, brow furrowed. Had the property manager left it? Or had it always been here? After feeding Milo, Leo explored the lighthouse more thoroughly. The spiral staircase led to the lantern room, where the great glass lens stood like a sleeping eye. Dust coated everything, but the structure was sound. He ran his fingers along the brass fittings, imagining the keepers who had once tended the light through storms and solitude. Back downstairs, he noticed a narrow door tucked behind a shelf in the sitting room. It creaked open to reveal a cramped storage space filled with old tools, ropes, and a stack of weathered books. One, in particular, caught his eye, a leather-bound logbook, its cover cracked and brittle. He carried it to the table and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with looping script, dated entries stretching back to the early 1900s. Some were mundane, weather reports, supply lists, notes about repairs. But others were strange. Heard the whispering again last night. Thought it was the wind, but it spoke my name. The cat returned. Same eyes. Same silence. I swear it hasn't aged in years. Leo's pulse quickened. He flipped through more pages, each entry more cryptic than the last. Mentions of lights in the fog, voices in the walls, dreams that felt like memories. Milo jumped onto the table, startling him. The cat stared at the logbook, then at Leo, as if urging him to keep reading. "What is this place?" Leo whispered. The lighthouse creaked in response. Leo spent the rest of the morning poring over the logbook. The entries spanned decades, each written by a different hand, yet all shared a strange undercurrent, an awareness of something unseen. The lighthouse, it seemed, had always been more than a beacon for ships. It was a keeper of secrets. One entry from 1937 caught his attention. "Storm came hard last night. Light held. But I saw her again, on the rocks. Pale dress, hair like seaweed. She vanished when I called out." Milo wouldn't leave the window. Leo glanced at the cat, now curled on the windowsill, tail flicking lazily. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he murmured. Milo blinked slowly, then turned his gaze back to the sea. That afternoon, Leo ventured outside. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the jagged coastline and a narrow path that wound down toward the rocks. He followed it, boots crunching over gravel and seaweed. The air was thick with salt and the distant cry of gulls. At the base of the cliff, he found a small cove, half hidden by boulders. The tide was low, revealing tide pools teeming with life. But what caught his eye was a piece of driftwood lodged between two stones, carved with initials, EK 1912. He traced the letters with his fingers. A name from the logbook? He couldn't remember. He'd have to check. Back at the lighthouse, he flipped through the pages again. There it was. Elias Kearney, Keeper, 1910 to 1915. His entries were sparse but poetic, filled with longing and references to a woman named Maris. She comes with the tide. I know she's not of this world, but I wait for her all the same. Leo sat back, heart thudding. Was Maris a ghost? A legend? A hallucination born of isolation? The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Milo jumped down and padded to the door, meowing once before sitting expectantly. "You want me to follow?" Leo asked. The cat flicked his tail. Leo grabbed his coat and opened the door. The wind hit him like a wave, but Milo darted out, leading him around the side of the lighthouse to a patch of overgrown grass. There, half buried in the earth, was a rusted tin box. He knelt and pried it open. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon, and a photograph, sepia-toned, of a man in a keeper's uniform and a woman with wild hair and a distant smile. Leo's breath caught. The lighthouse wasn't just whispering. It was remembering. Leo carried the tin box inside, careful not to disturb the brittle ribbon around the letters. He laid them out on the table beside the logbook, the photograph resting on top like a seal. Milo hopped up beside him, tail twitching, eyes fixed on the photo. The letters were written in the same looping hand as Elias Kearney's log entries. The ink had faded, but the words still held their shape, their weight. Leo unfolded the first one. Maris, the sea was calm tonight, but I felt you in the wind. I lit the lamp early, hoping you'd see it. Hoping you'd come. The others say I'm mad, but I know you're real. You're the only thing that feels real anymore. Leo read through them slowly, each letter a thread in a tapestry of longing and mystery. Maris was no ordinary woman. Elias described her as a presence, sometimes seen, sometimes only felt. She came with the fog, with the tide, with the dreams that lingered long after waking. One letter chilled him. I followed your voice down to the rocks. You sang to me. I nearly stepped into the sea. Milo stopped me. He always knows. He sees what I can't. Leo looked at the cat, now watching him with unnerving stillness. You're not just a stray, are you? He whispered. Milo blinked once, then turned his gaze to the window. That night, the wind howled louder than before. Leo couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, the logbook in his lap, the letters spread around him like a seance. The lighthouse groaned with age and memory. Then, just past midnight, he heard it. A voice. Faint, melodic, drifting through the walls like mist. He stood, heart pounding, and followed the sound up the spiral staircase. The lantern room was dark, the great lens silent. But the voice was clearer now, singing, mournful and beautiful. He stepped to the window and looked down. There, on the rocks below, stood a figure in white. Hair wild in the wind. Face turned toward the sea. She vanished as the beam of the lighthouse flickered to life, though Leo hadn't touched a thing. Behind him, Milo meowed softly. The lighthouse was awake. Leo didn't sleep that night. He sat in the lantern room, wrapped in a blanket, the logbook open on his lap and Milo curled at his feet. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the sea in slow, rhythmic arcs, illuminating the fog in ghostly flashes. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, the figure on the rocks, the voice in the wind, the light coming to life on its own. By morning, the fog had thinned, revealing a pale, washed-out sky. Leo descended the stairs, his legs stiff, his mind buzzing. He needed answers. Not just from the logbook, but from the town. He hadn't ventured into the nearby village yet. The lighthouse was a few miles from the edge of town, and he'd brought enough supplies to avoid contact for a while. But now, curiosity outweighed solitude. He scribbled a quick note, "Gone to town. Don't burn the place down," and left it on the table for Milo, who watched him leave with a flick of his tail. The drive into town was quiet. The road wound through coastal hills and patches of pine forest before opening into a small harbor village. Weathered buildings lined the main street, their signs faded but charming: the Salty Gull Cafe, Mariner's Market, Tide and Time Antiques. Leo parked and headed for the cafe. Inside, the scent of coffee and fried dough greeted him. Locals sat at mismatched tables, murmuring over newspapers and steaming mugs. A woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. "You're not from around here," she said, drying her hands on a towel. "Just moved into the lighthouse," Leo replied. That got everyone's attention. The room quieted. A few heads turned. The woman's smile faltered, just slightly. "Well," she said, recovering, "you've got yourself a piece of history up there." "I'm starting to realize that," Leo said. "I found a logbook. Mentions of strange things. A woman named Maris. And a cat that's apparently been around forever." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Milo?" Leo nodded. She leaned in, voice low. "You might want to talk to Elsie. She runs the antique shop down the street. Knows more about that lighthouse than anyone alive." Leo thanked her and stepped back into the street, the weight of a dozen curious stares following him. The lighthouse had whispered. Now the town was beginning to speak. The bell above the door to Tide and Time Antiques jingled softly as Leo stepped inside. The shop smelled of old paper and sea salt, and every surface was cluttered with relics. Brass compasses, faded maps, glass buoys, and shelves of books with cracked spines. A ship's will hung on the far wall, flanked by portraits of long-dead sailors. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 70s, her silver hair pulled into a loose braid, her eyes sharp behind round spectacles. She looked up from a ledger and smiled faintly. "You must be the new keeper," she said. Leo hesitated. "I'm just staying there. I'm an artist." "Same thing," she replied, standing. The lighthouse chooses who it wants. Her name was Elsie, and she moved with the quiet grace of someone who had spent her life listening to the sea. Leo explained what he'd found: the logbook, the letters, the photograph, and the strange entries about Maris and Milo. Elsie listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she walked to a shelf and pulled down a thick binder. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and old photographs. Elias Kearney was real, she said, flipping to a page. He kept the light from 1910 to 1915. Died in a storm. They never found his body. Leo leaned in. And Maris? Elsie tapped a photo, grainy, taken from a distance. A woman in white, standing on the rocks. Local legend. Some say she was a shipwreck survivor. Others say she was never human at all. The sea has its own stories. And Milo? Elsie smiled. That cat's been seen around the lighthouse for over a century. Always black. Always those eyes. Some say he's the lighthouse's guardian. Leo felt a chill. I saw her. Last night. On the rocks. Elsie's gaze sharpened. Then you're part of the story now. She handed him a folded map. There's a cave beneath the lighthouse. Hidden at high tide. Elias mentioned it once. If you want answers, that's where you start. Leo took the map, heart pounding. The lighthouse had opened its doors. Now it was showing him the way. Leo returned to the lighthouse just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cliffs. The map Elsie had given him was hand-drawn, with faded ink and annotations in the margins. It showed a narrow trail behind the lighthouse, leading down to a rocky outcrop and a cave marked simply, Elias Passage. Inside, Milo greeted him with a soft meow and a flick of his tail. Leo knelt and scratched behind the cat's ears. We're going exploring, he said. You coming? Milo trotted to the door in response. The trail was steep and overgrown, but the map's directions were precise. Leo moved carefully, flashlight in hand, the wind tugging at his coat. The sound of the waves grew louder as he descended, until he reached a ledge overlooking the sea. There, half hidden by a curtain of hanging moss, was the cave. He ducked inside. The air was damp and cool, filled with the scent of salt and stone. The walls shimmered faintly with mineral deposits, and the floor sloped downward into darkness. Leo followed the path, flashlight beam dancing across the rock. Milo padded silently beside him. At the end of the passage, the cave opened into a small chamber. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and atop it, a sealed glass jar containing a rolled parchment. Leo approached slowly, heart pounding. He lifted the jar and opened it. The parchment was fragile, but the ink was still legible. To the one who finds this, the lighthouse remembers. It watches. It waits. Maris is not a ghost, but a memory made flesh. She is the sea's sorrow, and its guardian. If you hear her song, do not follow. Not unless your heart is ready to break. Leo stared at the words, the weight of them pressing down like the tide. He looked at Milo, who sat perfectly still, eyes glowing in the dim light. The lighthouse had led him here. To its heart. To its warning. Leo emerged from the cave just as the tide began to rise, the waves licking at the rocks like curious fingers. He clutched the parchment tightly, its warning echoing in his mind. Do not follow. Not unless your heart is ready to break. The wind had picked up, and the sky was darkening again, clouds rolling in from the west. Milo led the way back up the trail, pausing every few steps to glance back, as if making sure Leo was still with him. Back inside the lighthouse, Leo lit the fire and sat at the table, spreading out the map, the letters, and the parchment. The photograph of Elias and Mara stared up at him, frozen in time. He traced her face with his finger. There was something haunting in her expression, something that felt like recognition. He opened the logbook again, flipping to the final entries from Elias. She came to me last night. Not in dreams. In flesh. Her hand was cold, but her eyes were warm. She said the sea remembers what the world forgets. I'm going with her. I have to. The light will guide the next. Milo will know. Leo closed the book slowly. The next. He stood and walked to the window. The sea was a churning mass of gray and silver, the horizon lost in mist. The lighthouse beam swept across the water, steady and strong. And then, just for a moment, he saw her again. Standing on the rocks. Hair wild. Dress clinging to her form. Eyes fixed on the lighthouse. Leo's breath caught. She raised her hand. Not beckoning. Warning. Behind him, Milo hissed. The fire flickered. And the whisper came again, soft, sorrowful, and unmistakably real. Leo turned slowly, the whisper still hanging in the air like mist. The fire had dimmed to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Milo stood rigid, ears flattened, eyes locked on the staircase. Another whisper. Closer this time. Leo. He moved toward the stairs, heart pounding, each step creaking beneath his weight. The spiral staircase stretched upward into darkness, the lantern room above silent and still. He climbed slowly, flashlight in hand, the beam trembling slightly. At the top, the room was empty. But the air was different, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. He stepped to the window and looked out. The sea was calm now, unnaturally so. The figure on the rocks was gone. Only the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam remained, cutting through the night like a heartbeat. Then he noticed something new. A shape in the corner of the lantern room. A small, wooden box that hadn't been there before. He approached it cautiously. The box was old, carved with intricate patterns of waves and stars. He opened it. Inside was a compass. Its needle spun wildly, then stopped, pointing not north, but out to sea. Leo picked it up. The metal was warm to the touch. Behind him, Milo let out a low, rumbling growl. The beam of the lighthouse flickered. And then, for the briefest moment, the room was filled with the scent of salt and roses. A voice, softer now, almost pleading, "Help me remember." Leo turned, but there was no one there. Only the lighthouse. And the sea. And the memory of a name that wasn't his, but felt like it had always belonged to him. Leo didn't sleep that night either. He sat in the lantern room, the compass in his hand, watching the needle tremble and twitch. It still pointed out to sea, unwavering, as if something out there was calling to him. The fire downstairs had long since died, but he didn't move. Milo stayed close, curled at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to stare into the shadows. By dawn, Leo had made a decision. He descended the stairs, gathered the letters, the logbook, the photograph, and the map, and laid them all out on the table. He needed to understand the full story: Elias, Maris, the cave, the whispers. The lighthouse wasn't just a place. It was a memory machine, a vessel of grief and longing, and somehow, it had chosen him. He flipped to the final page of the logbook. There was one last entry, written in a different hand, shaky, rushed. The light is fading. She's waiting. I see her in the waves. I go not to die, but to remember. If you find this, don't mourn me. Follow the light. Follow her song. No name. No date. Leo stared at the words until they blurred. Later that morning, he returned to the cave. The tide was low again, the entrance exposed. He brought the compass, the map, and a lantern. Milo followed, silent as ever. This time, he noticed something new. Carvings on the cave walls, symbols, names, dates. Some were over a century old. Others looked fresh. One name appeared again and again, Maris. At the far end of the chamber, beyond the pedestal, was a narrow tunnel. The map hadn't shown it. Leo hesitated, then stepped through. The tunnel opened into a second chamber, smaller, round, with a pool of seawater at its center. The water shimmered with an unnatural light, pale blue and pulsing like a heartbeat. Leo stepped closer. And then he heard it again. The song. Not from the walls. From the water. The song was unlike anything Leo had ever heard. Neither melody nor language, but something deeper, older. It resonated in his chest, in his bones, like the echo of a memory he couldn't quite place. The pool shimmered brighter with each note, casting ripples of light across the cave walls. Milo stayed at the edge of the chamber, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the water. Leo knelt beside the pool. The surface was impossibly still, like glass, yet the light within it pulsed with life. He reached out, hesitated, then dipped his fingers in. The water was warm. And then, a vision. Not a dream. Not a hallucination. A memory, but not his. He stood on the cliffs, wind tearing at his coat. The sea below was wild, waves crashing against the rocks. A woman stood beside him, Maris. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, her hand in his. You don't have to stay, she said, voice trembling. You can let go. I can't, he heard himself say. Not while you're still bound. She turned to the sea. Then we'll wait. Together. The vision shattered. Leo gasped, stumbling back from the pool. The chamber was silent again. The light in the water dimmed, fading to a soft glow. He sat there for a long time, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. It hadn't been Elias. It had been him. Or someone who looked like him. Felt like him. A memory made flesh. He looked at Milo. What am I? The cat blinked slowly. The lighthouse groaned above them, a deep, resonant sound like a ship's hull shifting in the tide. Leo stood, the compass still clutched in his hand. The needle spun again, then stopped, pointing not to the sea this time, but back toward the lighthouse. The path had changed. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Leo emerged from the cave with the compass still warm in his hand, the vision lingering like sea mist in his mind. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of rain and something older, salt, roses, and memory. Milo trotted ahead, tail high, leading him back toward the lighthouse. Inside, the air felt different. Charged. Expectant. Leo placed the compass on the table beside the logbook and letters. He stared at the photograph of Elias and Maris, then at the final entry in the logbook. Follow the light. Follow her song. He lit the fire again, its glow casting dancing shadows across the walls. Milo settled into his usual spot on the armchair, but his eyes never left Leo. The lighthouse creaked. Leo stood and walked to the spiral staircase, ascending slowly, deliberately. The lantern room was quiet, the great lens still. He stepped to the window and looked out. The sea was calm. And then, the beam flickered. Once. Twice. Then it stopped. Darkness swallowed the coast. Leo felt it before he saw it, a presence behind him. He turned slowly. Maris stood in the center of the room. She was not ghostly. Not translucent. She was real. Her dress clung to her like sea foam, her hair wild and damp, her eyes impossibly deep. You found the memory, she said softly. Leo couldn't speak. She stepped closer. The lighthouse remembers. It holds what the world forgets. Elias gave himself to it. So did I. Now it's your turn. Leo swallowed. Why me? Maris smiled, sad and knowing. Because you're broken. And only the broken can hear the song. She reached out, her hand hovering just above his chest. Will you remember me? Leo looked into her eyes and saw the tide, the storm, the silence. And he whispered, yes. The light flared to life. The song rose again. And the lighthouse began to whisper a new story. The light from the lantern room blazed like a second sun, cutting through the fog and darkness with a brilliance that seemed to pulse with life. Leo stood frozen, Maris's hand still hovering near his chest, her eyes locked on his. Then, slowly, she stepped back. The light dimmed to its usual rhythm, steady and calm. Maris's form shimmered, like a reflection on water, and she began to fade. Wait, Leo said, reaching out. Her voice was barely a whisper. You've opened the door. The rest is up to you. And then she was gone. The room fell silent, save for the soft hum of the lens turning and the distant crash of waves below. Leo stood alone, the compass in his hand, its needle now spinning slowly, as if unsure of where to point. He descended the stairs in a daze, Milo padding silently behind him. The fire had burned low again, casting long shadows across the sitting room. Leo sat heavily in the armchair, the photograph of Elias and Maris still on the table. He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up his sketchpad. His hand moved without thought, guided by something deeper than memory. He drew the cave, the pool of light, the vision of Maris on the cliffs. He drew the compass, the carvings, the moment her hand nearly touched his heart. And finally, he drew her face, sorrowful, beautiful, eternal. When he finished, he looked at Milo. I think I was meant to come here, he said softly. Not just to heal, but to remember something I never knew I'd forgotten. Milo blinked slowly, then leapt onto the windowsill, staring out at the sea. Outside, the fog thickened once more. And somewhere in the distance, the song began again. The sun rose lazily over Willow Creek, casting a golden hue across the sleepy town nestled between rolling hills and whispering pines. The scent of dew-kissed grass mingled with the faint aroma of cinnamon and yeast wafting from Clara's Corner Bakery, the little shop tucked between the post office and the antique store on Main Street. Clara Bennett stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour, her auburn hair tied back in a messy bun. She stared at the "Help Wanted" sign taped to the window, then at the dwindling contents of the display case: 2 blueberry muffins, a single croissant, and a lopsided cinnamon roll. Business had been slow. Too slow. And with rent due in 2 weeks, she needed a miracle. Or a pie. More specifically, the pie. The Willow Creek Bake-Off was just 2 weeks away, and the grand prize, $5,000 and a year's worth of free publicity, could save her bakery. But winning meant beating the town's best, including the reigning champion, Marla Dobbins, who had a reputation for sabotaging competitors with a smile. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at the old man sitting at the corner table, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. Mr. Henderson, once the town's most celebrated baker, had retired years ago after his wife passed. But his lemon meringue pie was still the stuff of legend. "Mr. Henderson," Clara said, approaching his table with a hopeful smile. "You ever think about entering the bake-off again?" He chuckled, the sound like gravel in a tin can. "Not unless they let me enter with a ghost. That recipe died with my memory." Clara sat across from him, leaning in. "But you remember some of it, right? The filling? The crust?" He squinted at her, then took a long sip of coffee. "Bits and pieces." "Why?" Clara hesitated. "Because I want to make it. For the bake-off." Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "You think you can recreate my pie?" "I think," she said, "with your help, I can try." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Clara. Let's see if you've got the guts, and the palate, for it." Outside, the town square buzzed with early preparations. Banners were being strung between lampposts, and the scent of fresh paint lingered as volunteers touched up the bake-off stage. Willow Creek was waking up, and with it, the heat of competition. Clara spent the afternoon in the bakery's cramped kitchen, scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad while Mr. Henderson sat nearby, his cane resting against the counter. He tapped his fingers on the table, eyes closed, as if trying to summon the ghost of his recipe from the depths of memory. "It wasn't just lemon," he muttered. "It had zest. Real zest. Meyer lemons, not those sour things from the store." Clara jotted it down. "Meyer lemons. Got it." "And the crust," he continued, "was flaky, but not dry. Butter and lard. No shortcuts." She nodded, already imagining the delicate balance of fat and flour. "Butter and lard. Okay." He opened one eye. "You ever make meringue that stands like a cathedral?" Clara laughed. "Mine usually slumps like a tired dog." Mr. Henderson chuckled. "Then we've got work to do." Outside, the town's energy was building. Kids rode bikes past the bakery, shouting about the upcoming pie-eating contest. The local radio station played upbeat tunes from the gazebo, and Mayor Tillman was spotted directing volunteers with a clipboard and a megaphone. At the general store, Marla Dobbins was holding court near the flower aisle, her perfectly coiffed hair and cherry-red lipstick as bold as ever. She was surrounded by admirers, all eager to hear about her latest creation, a triple-layered chocolate ganache tart with a hint of cayenne. "Clara's entering?" Marla said, feigning surprise. "How quaint. I suppose someone has to come in last." Back at the bakery, Clara rolled out dough with determination. Mr. Henderson watched her closely, occasionally offering a grunt of approval or a sharp correction. "No, no, don't overwork it. You want it to whisper, not shout." Clara adjusted her technique, sweat beading on her forehead. "I'm trying." You're learning, he said, softer now. That's more than most. As the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across Main Street, Clara placed her first test pie in the oven. The scent of lemon and sugar filled the air, and for a moment, she allowed herself to hope. The oven timer dinged, sharp and sudden in the quiet kitchen. Clara jumped, then rushed to the stove, heart thudding. She opened the door and was greeted by a wave of citrus-sweet heat. The pie sat golden and proud on the middle rack, its meringue peaks lightly toasted, the crust a delicate, buttery brown. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Looks right," he said. "But looks can lie." Clara set the pie on the cooling rack and waited. The scent was intoxicating, bright lemon, warm sugar, a hint of vanilla. She sliced a piece, the filling holding firm but soft, the crust flaking at the touch of the knife. She handed him a forkful. He chewed slowly, eyes closed again. Clara watched every twitch of his face, every furrow of his brow. "Well?" she asked. He swallowed. "It's close. Real close. But it's missing something." Clara deflated. "What?" "More zest. Less sugar." He shook his head. "No. It's heart. My wife used to hum when she baked. Said it stirred the soul into the batter. Maybe that's what's missing." Clara smiled, despite herself. "I can hum." He chuckled. "Then hum, girl. Hum like your life depends on it." The next morning, Clara was back at it, humming softly as she zested lemons and folded egg whites. Mr. Henderson sat nearby, offering cryptic advice and the occasional story about his wife, Margaret, who once beat a French pastry chef in a blind taste test at the county fair. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with gossip. Word had spread that Clara was working with Mr. Henderson, and speculation ran wild. Some cheered her on, others scoffed. Marla, of course, was livid. "She's using his recipe," she said to her husband, Ted, as they walked their poodle past the bakery. "That's practically cheating." Ted shrugged. "Sounds like smart baking to me." Marla narrowed her eyes. "We'll see about that." Inside the bakery, Clara pulled her second pie from the oven. This time, she was humming a lullaby she used to sing to her son, Jamie, when he was little. The meringue stood taller. The scent was richer. And when Mr. Henderson took a bite, he smiled. "There it is," he said. "That's the one." Clara stared at the pie, her heart swelling with cautious pride. Mr. Henderson dabbed his mouth with a napkin and leaned back in his chair, eyes twinkling. "You've got it," he said. "That's the pie." Clara grinned, but the moment was short-lived. The bell above the bakery door jingled, and in walked Jamie, her 12-year-old son, backpack slung over one shoulder and a smear of paint on his cheek. "Mom," he called. "They're painting the bake-off banner. It's huge." Clara wiped her hands and walked over, ruffling his hair. "You hungry?" Jamie nodded, eyeing the pie. "Can I try it?" Mr. Henderson gestured grandly. "Be my guest, young man. You're about to taste history." Jamie took a bite and closed his eyes. "Whoa. This is like sunshine and clouds." Clara laughed. "That's the goal." As Jamie settled into his usual seat with a sketch pad, Clara turned back to Mr. Henderson. "So what now?" He tapped the table. "Now you practice. Every day. Until it's second nature. And then you win." The next week passed in a blur of flour, sugar, and lemon zest. Clara baked pie after pie, each one better than the last. Mr. Henderson became a fixture in the bakery, offering advice and stories, while Jamie helped with deliveries and kept spirits high with his goofy jokes and endless doodles. Meanwhile, Marla ramped up her campaign. She hosted tastings at her home, posted glossy photos of her tart on social media, and even gave an interview to the local paper, claiming she was more than ready to defend her crown. Clara ignored the noise. She focused on her pie, her technique, and the rhythm of baking. She hummed every time, letting the melody guide her hands. On the eve of the bake-off, Clara stood in her kitchen, staring at her final test pie. It was perfect. She could feel it. Mr. Henderson took a bite and nodded solemnly. "You've done it," he said. "Now go show them." Outside, the town square was lit with fairy lights, the stage set, the judges' table gleaming under the stars. Willow Creek was ready. And so was Clara. The morning of the bake-off dawned bright and clear, the sky a perfect canvas of blue. Clara stood in her kitchen, nerves fluttering in her stomach like moths. Her final pie sat in its carrier, wrapped in a checkered cloth, the meringue still pristine under the glass dome. Jamie appeared in the doorway, dressed in his best button-up shirt and holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "Vote for Mom's Pie," in bold, colorful letters. "You ready?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." The town square was already bustling when they arrived. Booths lined the perimeter, each one decorated with gingham, bunting, and the sweet scent of sugar and spice. The stage was set with a long table for the judges, and a crowd had begun to gather, buzzing with anticipation. Clara found her assigned booth, #14, nestled between the high school's culinary club and a retired firefighter named Gus who specialized in pecan pies. She set up her display, smoothing the tablecloth and arranging slices on delicate china plates. Mr. Henderson arrived a few minutes later, wearing a crisp vest and a fedora that looked like it hadn't seen daylight in years. He gave her a nod of approval. "You've got this," he said. "Just remember, hum." Clara smiled. "Always." Across the square, Marla's booth gleamed like a magazine spread. Her tart sat atop a crystal pedestal, surrounded by fresh flowers and tiny jars of imported spices. She wore a red apron embroidered with her name in gold thread and greeted passers-by with a practiced smile. When she spotted Clara, her expression tightened. "Good luck," she said sweetly. "You'll need it." Clara simply nodded. "Thanks, Marla." "You too." The mayor stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. "Welcome, everyone, to the 42nd Annual Willow Creek Bake-Off. Let's give a warm round of applause to our bakers." The crowd erupted in cheers. Clara's heart pounded. This was it. The judges began their rounds, clipboards in hand, tasting and murmuring, nodding and scribbling. When they reached Clara's booth, she offered them each a slice with steady hands and a quiet smile. They took their bites. One of them, a stern woman with silver hair, paused, then took another. And smiled. Clara dared to hope. The judges moved on, but Clara's booth lingered in their expressions. The silver-haired woman whispered something to the others, and one of them turned back for a second slice. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she poured lemonade for a curious couple who'd wandered over after seeing the judges' reactions. Jamie waved his sign enthusiastically, drawing in more visitors. "Try my mom's pie. It's got magic in it." Mr. Henderson chuckled from his folding chair. "Kid's not wrong." Booth number 14 became a quiet sensation. Word spread quickly through the crowd. Clara's pie was something special. People lined up, murmuring about the flavor, the texture, the way it made them feel like summer had bloomed in their mouths. Marla watched from across the square, her smile growing tighter with each passing minute. She leaned over to Ted. "She's using nostalgia. That's cheating." Ted shrugged. "It's working." As the sun climbed higher, the judges returned to the stage. Mayor Tillman took the mic again, clearing his throat dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Our judges have deliberated, debated, and, yes, devoured. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for." The crowd hushed. Clara held Jamie's hand, her heart pounding. In third place, the mayor announced, Gus Witherspoon and his pecan pie. Applause rippled through the square. Gus tipped his hat and grinned. In second place, Marla Dobbins and her chocolate cayenne tart. Marla's smile froze. She clapped politely, but her eyes were locked on Clara. And in first place, the mayor said, voice rising, the winner of this year's Willow Creek Bake-Off. Clara Bennett, with her lemon meringue pie. The crowd erupted. Clara gasped, tears springing to her eyes. Jamie hooped and hugged her tight. Mr. Henderson stood slowly, clapping with a proud, quiet dignity. Clara stepped onto the stage, pie in hand, as the mayor handed her the oversized check and a golden pie tin trophy. "You've brought something special to this town," he said. "And reminded us all what baking is really about." Clara looked out at the crowd, then down at her pie. "It's about heart," she said. And humming. The celebration spilled into the evening, with music from the town band and slices of pie passed around like treasure. Clara stood beside her booth, surrounded by well-wishers, neighbors, and a few teary-eyed regulars who'd watched her bakery struggle through the lean months. Jamie danced around with his sign, now smudged and bent, but still proudly held aloft. Mr. Henderson sat nearby, sipping sweet tea and watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. "You did good, Clara," he said. "Real good." Clara knelt beside him. "I couldn't have done it without you." He waved a hand. "You had it in you. Just needed a little stirring." Marla packed up her booth with tight lips and stiff movements. Ted tried to help, but she brushed him off. "It's fine," she said. "Next year." Clara caught her eye and offered a small, genuine smile. "Your tart was beautiful." Marla paused, then nodded curtly. "So was your pie." It wasn't friendship, but it was something. Later that night, Clara returned to the bakery with Jamie. The trophy sat on the counter, gleaming under the soft lights. She placed the check in a drawer, knowing it would cover rent and then some. But more than that, she felt something shift, like the town had seen her, really seen her, and decided she belonged. Jamie curled up in the corner with his sketchpad, drawing a cartoon version of the pie with wings and a crown. Clara laughed and kissed his forehead. Mr. Henderson lingered by the door. "You ever think about bottling that filling? Could be something." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You want to go into business?" He grinned. "Maybe. I've got time. And you've got talent." She looked around the bakery, at the empty shelves and the warm scent of lemon still lingering in the air. "Let's talk tomorrow." Outside, Willow Creek settled into its summer night, the stars blinking above like sugar crystals scattered across velvet. And in the heart of town, Clara's corner bakery stood a little taller, its windows glowing with promise. The next morning, Clara arrived at the bakery before sunrise. The air was cool and still, the streets of Willow Creek quiet except for the occasional chirp of waking birds. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of flour and sugar, now tinged with something new, possibility. She turned on the lights, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. Not just baking, but planning. A new menu. A new sign. Maybe even a new name, Clara's Corner Bakery and Pie Company. She smiled at the thought. By mid-morning, Jamie arrived with a sketch of the new logo, a slice of lemon meringue pie with a crown and a tiny hummingbird perched on top. Clara laughed and hugged him tight. "It's perfect," she said. Mr. Henderson showed up not long after, carrying a small wooden box. He set it on the counter and opened it to reveal a stack of yellowed recipe cards, each one written in a looping, elegant script. "Margaret's collection," he said. "She'd want you to have them." Clara's breath caught. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "You're the future of baking in this town. These belong with you now." She took the box gently, as if it were made of glass. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I'll take good care of them." That afternoon, customers poured in, some curious, some congratulatory, all hungry. Clara served slice after slice of her now famous pie, along with fresh scones, muffins, and a new lemon shortbread that Jamie had named Sunshine Bites. The bakery buzzed with life. Laughter, conversation, the clink of coffee cups. Clara moved through it all with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. As the sun dipped low again, casting golden light through the front windows, Clara stood behind the counter, watching her son draw, her mentor sip tea, and her neighbors smile. She hummed softly to herself, the same lullaby as before. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly right. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Clara's Corner Bakery became the talk of Willow Creek. Locals who hadn't stepped inside in years now came daily, eager for a slice of the award-winning lemon meringue pie or to try the new treats inspired by Margaret Henderson's recipe cards. Clara worked tirelessly, but with a joy she hadn't felt since opening the bakery. She hired a part-time assistant, Lena, a high school senior with a knack for decorating cupcakes, and even began teaching Jamie how to knead dough properly. One afternoon, as Clara was boxing up a dozen Sunshine Bites for a customer, the bell above the door jingled and in walked a woman in a crisp navy blazer, clipboard in hand. "Clara Bennett?" she asked. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. "That's me." The woman smiled. "I'm Dana from Sweet and Savory magazine. We heard about your win at the Willow Creek Bake-Off and wanted to feature you in our next issue." Clara blinked. "You're serious?" "Very. We'd love to do a photo shoot and an interview. Maybe even include your pie recipe, if you're willing." Clara glanced at Mr. Henderson, who was seated at his usual table, sipping tea and pretending not to eavesdrop. He gave her a subtle nod. "I'd be honored," Clara said. The article came out 2 weeks later, and with it came a flood of attention. Orders poured in from neighboring towns. A food blogger from Sacramento drove in just to try the pie. Clara even received an invitation to compete in the regional bake-off in Napa Valley. But through it all, she stayed grounded. She still hummed while she baked. She still let Jamie doodle on the chalkboard menu. And every morning, she still brewed a cup of tea for Mr. Henderson, who now referred to her as the Pie Queen of Willow Creek. One evening, as they closed up shop, Jamie looked up at her and said, "Mom, do you think Grandma would be proud?" Clara knelt beside him, brushing a curl from his forehead. "I think she'd be over the moon." And as the lights dimmed and the bakery settled into quiet, Clara knew this was just the beginning. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life in Willow Creek settled into a new, sweeter cadence. Clara's Corner Bakery thrived, not just as a business, but as a gathering place. Locals came for the pie, but stayed for the warmth, the laughter, and the sense that something special was always just coming out of the oven. Clara had started a weekly pie and story night, where townsfolk shared memories over dessert. Mr. Henderson told tales of baking with Margaret during the war years, while teenagers recited poems and Jamie read aloud from his comic series, The Adventures of Captain Crust. One Thursday evening, as the bakery buzzed with chatter and the scent of cinnamon apple galettes, Clara noticed a familiar face in the doorway, Mayor Tillman, holding a folder and wearing a grin. "Clara," he said, stepping forward, "I've got a proposal for you." She raised an eyebrow. "Should I be nervous?" "Only if you hate good news." He opened the folder and laid out a plan for the town's fall festival. "We want you to lead the culinary committee. Design the food events, judge the contests, maybe even host a baking workshop." Clara blinked. "Me? You're the heart of Willow Creek now," he said. "It's only fitting." She looked around the bakery, at Jamie laughing with Lena, at Mr. Henderson nodding off in his chair, at the line of customers still waiting patiently for their slice of something sweet, and felt a swell of gratitude. "I'd love to," she said. That night, after the last crumb had been swept and the lights dimmed, Clara stood at the front window, watching the quiet street. She thought of the first pie, the first hum, the first moment she dared to believe she could win. And now, she wasn't just baking to survive. She was baking to build something. Something lasting. Behind her, Jamie's voice called out sleepily, "Mom? Can we make a new pie tomorrow?" Clara smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." "What kind?" He yawned. "Something with stars in it." She turned back to the kitchen, already imagining the recipe. Stars it is. The next morning, Clara stood at the prep table with a fresh notepad and a bowl of ripe blueberries. Jamie sat nearby, swinging his legs and sketching constellations. "So," she said, tapping her pencil against the counter, "a pie with stars. What does that taste like?" Jamie grinned. "Blueberries for the night sky. Maybe lemon again, for starlight. And something sparkly." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Sparkly?" "Like sugar crystals on top," he said. "So it glows." She nodded thoughtfully. "Blueberry lemon with a sugared crust. I like it." They worked side by side, experimenting with fillings and crusts, humming together as the oven warmed the kitchen. The first attempt was too tart. The second, too sweet. But the third, was just right. Clara sprinkled coarse sugar over the crust before baking, and when it came out, it shimmered like frost under moonlight. They named it Starlight Pie. By the weekend, it was on the menu, and customers were enchanted. Kids pointed at the glittering crust, and adults closed their eyes after the first bite, savoring the balance of tang and sweetness. Mr. Henderson declared it a pie worthy of a telescope. The bakery's chalkboard now read, "Today's specials: lemon meringue, champion slice; sunshine bites; starlight pie sparkles; Margaret's apple butter tarts." Clara stood behind the counter, watching the line stretch out the door. She felt something she hadn't in years, not just relief, not just pride, but belonging. Willow Creek wasn't just her hometown anymore. It was her community. Her family. And as the bell above the door jingled again and again, she knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. Autumn crept into Willow Creek with a whisper of wind and a rustle of amber leaves. The town's trees turned golden, and the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg seemed to hang in the air like a promise. Clara's bakery adapted with the season: pumpkin scones, spiced apple turnovers, and a new creation, harvest moon pie, a blend of roasted pear, maple, and a hint of clove. The bakery's windows were decorated with Jamie's hand-cut paper leaves and a banner that read, "Fall into Flavor." Locals stopped by to admire the display, and more than a few asked if Clara would be entering the regional bake-off in Napa Valley. She hadn't decided. The invitation sat on her desk, unopened for days. It wasn't fear, she'd proven herself. It was something deeper. A question of whether she wanted to chase bigger stages or keep building what she'd started here. One evening, after closing, Clara sat with Mr. Henderson and Jamie at the kitchen table. The boy was working on a new comic, and the old man was sipping cider. "You going to Napa?" Mr. Henderson asked. Clara shrugged. "I don't know. It's a big deal. Fancy judges. Cameras. Pressure." He leaned forward. "You think Margaret and I started baking to impress judges? We did it because it brought people together. Because it made them feel something." Jamie looked up. "You could make them feel something in Napa, too." Clara smiled. "You two are quite the team." Mr. Henderson winked. "We're your advisory board." She laughed, then reached for the invitation. She opened it slowly, read the details, and set it down. "I'll go," she said. "But only if I can bring my humming." Jamie grinned. "And your stars." Mr. Henderson raised his mug. To Clara. "The Pie Queen of Willow Creek, and maybe Napa, too." They clinked mugs and glasses, cider and cocoa and dreams mingling in the warm light of the bakery. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering leaves across the sidewalk. And inside, Clara felt the stirrings of a new chapter. The weeks leading up to the Napa Valley Regional Bake-Off were a blur of preparation. Clara balanced the growing demands of the bakery with late-night recipe testing, often with Jamie asleep at the counter and Mr. Henderson offering sleepy critiques from his usual chair. The regional competition was a different world, larger, louder, and far more competitive than Willow Creek's cozy affair. Clara would be up against professional pastry chefs, culinary school graduates, and even a former contestant from a televised baking show. But she wasn't intimidated. She packed her ingredients carefully, including a small jar of lemon zest she dried herself, and a folded note from Jamie that read, "Don't forget to hum." The morning of the competition, Clara arrived at the Napa Valley Culinary Pavilion, a sleek glass building surrounded by vineyards and the scent of lavender. Inside, rows of stainless steel stations gleamed under bright lights. Cameras hovered. Judges in crisp chef's whites moved with quiet authority. Clara took her place at Station 12 and began to set up. She wore her Willow Creek apron, patched and flour-stained, and tucked Jamie's note into her pocket. As the timer began, she closed her eyes, took a breath, and started to hum. The pie came together like a memory, zest, sugar, eggs, and butter folding into a golden filling. The meringue whipped into soft peaks, then stiffened like clouds catching the wind. She piped it carefully, torching the tips until they browned just so. When the timer buzzed, she stepped back, heart pounding. The judges made their rounds. One of them, a stern man with a French accent, took a bite of her pie, then paused. He looked at her, then at the pie, then took another bite. Clara didn't dare breathe. Finally, he nodded. "This is joy." She smiled, tears prickling her eyes. The judges conferred for what felt like hours. Clara stood near her station, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart thudding with every passing second. Around her, the other contestants whispered and paced, some confident, others visibly shaken. When the head judge returned to the microphone, the room fell silent. In third place, he announced, for her exquisite pistachio rose tart, Chef Lila Moreau. Polite applause followed. Clara clapped, her palms damp. In second place, for a daring take on a savory sweet fig galette, Chef Marcus Lim. More applause. Clara's breath caught. And in first place, the judge said, pausing for dramatic effect, for a lemon meringue pie that reminded us all why we fell in love with baking in the first place. Clara Bennett, from Willow Creek. The room erupted. Clara stood frozen for a moment, stunned. Then she stepped forward, hands trembling, as the judges handed her a ribbon, a certificate, and a bouquet of sunflowers. Your pie, the French judge said, was not just delicious. It was honest. That is rare. Clara smiled, blinking back tears. Thank you. I baked it with heart. Later, as she stepped outside into the golden Napa sunlight, she pulled out her phone and called the bakery. Jamie answered. Did you win? I did, she said, laughing. We did. Cheers erupted in the background. Lena, Mr. Henderson, and a few customers who had clearly been waiting by the phone. Clara looked out over the vineyards, the sun warm on her face. She had come here to prove something, to herself, to the world. But what she'd found was something even better, a reminder that the best things in life rise slowly, with care, and always with a little bit of humming. Clara returned to Willow Creek to a hero's welcome. The town square was decked out in bunting and balloons, and a hand-painted sign stretched across Main Street, "Welcome home, Pie Queen." Jamie ran into her arms the moment she stepped out of the car, nearly knocking the ribbon from her suitcase. Mr. Henderson stood nearby, cane in one hand, a proud smile on his face. You did it, he said simply. Clara laughed, hugging him. We did it. The bakery was packed that afternoon. Locals lined up for a taste of the now famous lemon meringue pie, and Clara had to bake 3 batches of starlight pie just to keep up with demand. Lena managed the counter like a pro, and Jamie handed out tiny paper crowns to every customer. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara stood outside the bakery, watching the last of the crowd drift away. The golden ribbon from Napa fluttered in the window, and the scent of sugar and citrus lingered in the air. Mr. Henderson joined her, leaning on his cane. You ever think about what's next? Clara looked up at the stars beginning to appear. I used to think I needed to win to prove something. But now, I just want to keep baking. Keep building this place. He nodded. That's the right kind of ambition. She turned to him. What about you? Ever think about teaching a class? Sharing more of Margaret's recipes? He chuckled. Only if you co-teach. Clara smiled. Deal. As the lights inside the bakery dimmed and the town settled into quiet, Clara felt a deep, steady peace. She had found her place, not just as a baker, but as a part of something bigger. A community. A legacy. And tomorrow, there would be more pies to bake, more stories to share, and more dreams to rise.